The temperature on the Minnesota side of Lake Superior that morning was 19 degrees Fahrenheit. Not wind chill, actual air temperature. Ray Thibodeau was on his third trip hauling lumber, and his breath was fogging up so thick he could barely see the boards in front of him. He had found the pile 4 days earlier. A garage on Elm Avenue, 2 miles from the riverbank camp where he was sleeping, had been knocked down by a city crew. The framing lumber, old-growth 2x4s, dry and straight, was stacked at the curb for trash pickup. Ray looked at that pile the way a jeweler looks at rough stones. He saw something no one else bothered to look for. He borrowed a rusted wheelbarrow from a man named Curtis who kept it behind his tent. He made 6 trips over 3 days, loading what he could carry, leaving what was too warped or cracked. By the time he was done, he had 47 usable studs, 8 2x6 boards, and a stack of 1-inch plywood sheeting that smelled like motor oil and old dogs. His camp neighbors watched him stack it all behind his tent. That is when Dennis, a heavy-set man in his late 40s who had been at the camp since August, walked over, looked at the pile, and laughed. Not a mean laugh, the kind of laugh a person gives when they are genuinely confused by what they are seeing. "Ray," Dennis said, "brother, it is November. What exactly are you building?" Ray Thibodeau turned 61 in September, 3 weeks after he moved into the riverbank camp. He spent his birthday eating a gas station sandwich and watching the St. Louis River go brown with autumn runoff. He had grown up in Hibbing, on the Iron Range. His father was a miner. His uncle was a framer. By the time Ray was 19, he was swinging a hammer on residential construction crews, learning the trade the way men learned it then. By watching, by doing, by getting corrected when you did it wrong. He became a finished carpenter by his late 20s, then a union framing contractor by his mid-30s. For 30 years he built custom homes across the Iron Range and the North Shore, big timber frame cabins for people with lake money, tight, well-insulated ramblers for working families in Eveleth and Virginia and Biwabik. He knew how heat moved through a building. He knew how cold found its way in. He knew the difference between a wall that looked right and a wall that performed right. That knowledge lived in his hands and in his eyes and in the way he walked through a frame structure before the drywall went up, checking for the invisible mistakes that would cost someone warmth for the next 40 years. The collapse came in pieces, the way it usually does. His wife, Sandra, filed for divorce in the spring of 2019, after 2 years of a marriage that had gone quiet and then cold and then just over. Ray did not fight it. He probably should have. The settlement split the house, the savings, and the equipment. He got the tools and a truck. She got the equity. He found a rental in 2 harbors and kept working. Then the work slowed. He was 60 years old and the contractors he used to call him knew a kid they could pay half as much. The calls got fewer. The savings got thinner. In the winter of 2021 he missed 2 months of rent. In the spring of 2022 he was evicted. He lived in his truck for 4 months. In a parking lot behind a warehouse on the edge of Duluth, until the truck needed a transmission repair he could not afford and was towed in August. He walked to the riverbank camp with his tools in a canvas bag and his sleeping bag under his arm. He had $38 in his pocket and the clearest understanding of load-bearing construction that most licensed architects will never have. That is where we find him. That is who he is. Ray had been in the camp for 6 weeks before he started planning. He was watching. That is what good carpenters do first. They watch. He watched how the wind came off the lake and moved through the camp. He noticed it hit hardest from the northwest, curling down the riverbank in a channel between 2 cottonwood trees. He watched which tents leaked in the rain and which held. He watched when moisture pooled on cold mornings. He watched the angle of the low November sun and calculated, from 30 years of sighting homes on lots, where it landed longest each afternoon. What Ray understood, and what nobody else in the camp was thinking about, was thermal bridging. It is a term from building science. It means the places in a wall where heat escapes fastest, usually where 2 pieces of material touch, creating a direct path for cold to travel through. Standard wall framing, the kind everyone uses, is full of thermal bridges. Every stud is one. Every nail is one. Ray had spent his career learning how to interrupt those bridges. In high-performance home construction, you do it by staggering the studs, offsetting the inner and outer framing members so that no single piece of wood touches both the cold outside and the warm inside. It is called a double stud wall or a staggered stud wall. It costs almost nothing extra if you know what you are doing. He was going to build it. Hey, on a riverbank in Duluth, with salvaged lumber and no budget, and the winter of 2022 arriving in 3 weeks. He started gathering additional materials. Behind a big box hardware store on the edge of town, he found a dumpster with partial rolls of 6mm polyethylene sheeting, the clear plastic used as vapor barrier in residential construction. He found a torn but largely intact roll of fiberglass bat insulation, R13, discarded after a job. He found flattened cardboard boxes in quantities he could not count, which he knew from experience had an R value of roughly R1 per inch when lead and kept dry. He carried the poly sheeting rolled under one arm. He dragged the insulation in 2 trips. The cardboard he stacked and tied with baling twine he found near the riverbank. People noticed. They always do. In a camp, everybody is watching everybody, partly out of boredom, partly out of the low-grade vigilance that living without walls requires. Dennis came by again and stood with his hands in his pockets. He was wearing 2 coats and still looked cold. A woman named Phyllis, who had a small tent near the cottonwood trees and kept a remarkable orderliness about her small piece of ground, walked over and studied the growing material pile without saying anything for a long moment. She had been at the camp for almost 2 years. She had seen people try things. She had seen those things fail, and watched the people who tried them leave or give up or simply disappear over a winter. How big? She asked finally. 8 by 8, Ray said. Interior. She looked at the lumber. She looked at him. 4'2". 4'2". She was quiet again. Then, the ground gets wet in late November. Underway you're thinking of building. I know, Ray said. I'm raising it 6 inches. Phyllis nodded slowly. That nod was not agreement. Exactly. It was the measured acknowledgement of someone who had learned to reserve judgment until they had more information. A younger man named Thibodeau, maybe 30 years old, wearing a Carhartt jacket with a broken zipper held shut with a safety pin, stopped and looked at the material pile from a distance. Man is building a house, he said to no one in particular, and then laughed, and then walked away. If you want to find out what Ray built on that riverbank, and what happened the night the temperature dropped to -9 or 31 inches of snow buried the camp, then subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Ray Thibodeau built on the banks of the St. Louis River is a story about what a man does when the only thing the world left him was everything he already knew. Ray started on a Monday. He had no power tools. His circular saw was gone, traded 2 months before the truck was towed. What he had was a hand saw, a framing hammer, a speed square, a tape measure, a carpenter's pencil, and a level. The same tools a carpenter would have carried in 1955. He began with the platform, 6-inch legs cut from the straightest 2x6s he had, sunk into the ground 2 inches and leveled with a scrap of shim stock he split from a plywood offcut. He laid a base frame, 2x6s on edge, forming a rectangle exactly 8 feet by 8 feet, exterior dimension. He cross-braced the platform frame with salvaged 1x3 strapping nailed in an X pattern underneath. Then he laid the plywood subflue, 2 full sheets of 3/4-inch plywood, cut slightly short to overlap the frame edges. He nailed them down with 16 penny framing nails, setting each nail with 3 strikes, the old rhythm. The 4 took most of the first day. His hands, which had not swung the hammer in 4 months, reminded him about that at midnight. The calluses he had carried for 30 years had softened. By the time he stopped, the web of his right hand, between thumb and index finger, was raw and hot. He slept that night in his tent, 8 feet from the platform he had built, and did not feel sorry for himself. He had built floors in the cold before. He had built them in the dark before. This was just a flaw. The wall framing took 3 days. The staggered stud system he was using required 2 parallel rows of studs, an outer row and an inner row, offset by 3 inches, so that no single stud touched both the exterior sheathing and the interior surface. The cavity between them was 5.5 inches wide. That is where the insulation would go. That is where the cold would stop. He cut every stud to exactly 7 feet 4 inches. He had decided on a ceiling height of 7 feet to give himself room to sit upright and move without crouching. The extra 4 inches were for the top plate bearing. He set his outer studs on 24-inch centers. His inner studs fell between them, tied together only at the top and bottom plates, creating a wall with no continuous thermal path from outside to inside. On the second day of framing, the handsaw blade cracked near the toe. This was the first real setback. A broken saw blade on a construction site is an inconvenience. On a riverbank with no money and no hardware store credit, it is a potential project killer. Ray sat with the broken blade for a while, turning it in his hands. Curtis, the man who had lent him the wheelbarrow, came by that afternoon. Curtis was a quiet man, mid-60s, who had been a machinist for 23 years before the plant where he worked was sold and relocated. He did not talk much. He watched Ray turn the broken blade in his hands. "What gauge?" Curtis asked. 8 point, Ray said. Curtis went to a canvas bag he kept tied to a folding chair outside his tent. He came back with a handsaw, older than Ray's, wood handle, the blade slightly discolored but the teeth still sharp. He held it out. "I kept it from the shop," Curtis said, "before they cleared us out. Thought I might need it someday." Ray took it. He looked at Curtis. Curtis sat down in a camp chair and said nothing more, but he stayed there for the rest of the afternoon, watching the frame go up. This is what Ray learned about Curtis over the following weeks. He had a daughter in Cloquet who called him on the first Sunday of every month. He had worked the same machine for 18 years, a vertical mill, cutting steel to tolerances of 1/1000th of an inch. When the plant closed and he eventually ended up at the camp, he had brought 3 things: a canvas bag, a folding chair, and the handsaw he had sharpened every Friday for 2 decades. He said once, quietly, without self-pity, "I always kept a good edge. That's just what you do." The walls rose slowly. Ray sheathed the exterior with the oil-stained plywood, then wrapped the entire structure in 2 layers of the 6mm poly sheeting, overlapping the seams by 12 inches and securing them with staples he borrowed from a staple gun he found in his canvas bag. The last one he had, driving them by hand with a flathead screwdriver and a tap from the hammer when the gun seized up. The insulation went in next. The R13 fiberglass bats filled the full 5.5-inch cavity between the staggered studs, where the bats ran short, in the upper corners and along one entire wall. Ray laid cardboard, pressing it tightly into the cavity, 4 and 5 layers deep. Dry, compressed cardboard in a sealed wall cavity is not a joke. It performs. It is not R13, but it is not nothing. The roof was of 4/12 pitch, just steep enough to shed a heavy snow load. He cut the rafters by hand, 6 of them, 2x6 stock, each with a bird's mouth notch he laid out with his speed square the way he had taught apprentices to do it for 30 years. The ridge board was a single 2x6 running the 8-foot span. He sheathed the roof with the remaining plywood and covered it with the rubber membrane, a piece of EPDM roofing material, black and heavy, that he had found rolled up against a fence near the demolition site. He could not nail it through without compromising the waterproofing, so he weighted its edges with rocks he carried up from the riverbank. 6 rocks on each side. He would seal the edges properly later, with cork he had not found yet. The door was the second serious setback. He had framed a rough opening, 30 inches wide, 6 feet 6 inches tall, but had nothing to fill it with. A 10 zipper will not stop a -9-degree wind. He needed a door. He spent half a day walking the alleys near the camp. He found nothing that would work. He came back and stood in front of the opening and looked at it for a long time. Phyllis appeared beside him. She had been watching the structure go up for 2 weeks, coming by each day a little closer than the day before. "The salvage place on Michigan Street," she said. "They had a stack of interior doors outside, leaning against the building. I don't know if they're still there." Ray walked 3 miles to the salvage place. There were 7 doors leaning against the building, as Phyllis had said. He found the owner inside. He explained what he was doing. The owner, a woman named Pat, around 50, who had inherited the place from her father, looked at him for a moment and then said, "The hollow core ones are $15. The solid ones are $25. I don't have anything for nothing, but I can do $10 for the hollow core if you're in a spot." Ray had $14. He paid $10 for a hollow core 6-panel interior door in reasonable condition. He carried it 3 miles back to camp on his shoulder, the way he had once carried sheet goods up stairwells on job sites. His shoulder ached for 2 days afterward. He built a simple door frame and hung the door with 2 hinges salvaged from the demolished garage boards. The door did not seal perfectly. There was a 1/4-inch gap at the bottom. He stuffed it with a folded piece of the polyethylene sheeting, which compressed into a decent draft seal. He added a simple hook and eye latch from his tool bag, the last piece of hardware he owned. The build, from first nail to hanging door, took 11 days. Ray had lost 4 pounds. He could feel the new knots in his shoulders from carrying lumber and sleeping cold. His right hand had rebuilt its calluses, harder than before. He stood outside the finished structure on the morning of the 12th day and looked at it. It was 8 feet by 8 feet. It was 5 feet 8 inches at the even 8 feet at the ridge. It was sided in mismatched plywood, wrapped in plastic, covered in a black rubber roof weighted with river rocks. It was, by any ordinary standard, an ugly thing. But Ray Thibodeau had built it with staggered studs and 5.5 inches of insulation in a sealed wall cavity and a vapor barrier that would keep the moisture from migrating through and destroying the insulation's performance. He had built it on a raised platform so the floor would not wet ground cold. He had pitched the roof to handle snow load. He had oriented the single small window, a piece of corrugated polycarbonate he had found and cut to fit a 14-inch rough opening on the south wall, where the low winter sun would add a few degrees of passive gain each afternoon. He had built it the way he built everything. Right. He moved in on a Thursday evening in late November. The outside temperature was 22 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no wind. He had a sleeping bag rated to 15 degrees, a wool blanket he had gotten from a church distribution in October, and his own body. That was all the heat he had. He closed the door. He sat down on the sleeping platform, a simple frame of 2x4s with a piece of plywood on top, padded with a folded moving blanket he had found. He sat still and just listened. The sound of the camp outside went quiet, not silent. He could still hear it, but it was muffled. That muffling was not just acoustic, it was thermal. Every inch of insulation that slowed sound also slowed heat loss. He sat there for a while without doing anything. After about 40 minutes he noticed his fingers were warm. Not from rubbing them together, just warm. The small space, 64 square feet of floor, maybe 400 cubic feet of air, was responding to his body. He was heating it. His own metabolic output, captured in a well-sealed envelope, was raising the air temperature around him. He did not have a thermometer that first night. He had a rough calibration from his body. He knew what 50 degrees felt like. He knew what 40 felt like. By the time he laid down to sleep, it felt like 50, maybe a little above. Outside it had dropped to 18 degrees. He pulled the blanket over his sleeping bag and lay on his back in the dark. The roof did not creak the way tent fabric does. The walls held still. He could hear the river. He could hear someone in the camp coughing. He could hear the distant sound of a truck on the highway bridge. He was warm, not comfortable in the way that word gets used for hotel rooms and heated cars, but warm in the way that a body, finally unbothered by cold, can simply rest, warm enough to sleep without clenching, warm enough for his hands to open. He was not a man given to demonstrations of feeling. He did not cry. He did not say anything. He just turned onto his side and went to sleep. If you have ever felt unseen, like the things you know and the work you are capable of have become invisible to the world around you, consider subscribing to stay connected with this community, because Ray's story is about more than insulation. It is about what happens when a person stops waiting for someone to give them permission to use what they know. Connection is its own kind of shelter. 31 inches. The storm arrived on November 19, 2022. The National Weather Service had issued a blizzard warning for the Duluth area beginning that Friday afternoon. The forecast called for 24 to 32 inches of snow, sustained winds of 35 to 44 miles per hour, and temperatures dropping to a low of -9 degrees Fahrenheit by Sunday morning. Wind chills were projected at -31 degrees. This was not a surprise storm. It was forecast clearly for 5 days. The city shelter system opened overflow capacity at 2 locations. By Friday night, both were full. People were turned away. The warming centers, libraries, community centers, were at capacity by Saturday noon. The temperature that afternoon was 4 degrees above zero and falling. In the riverbank camp, people made decisions. Some left for the shelters early and got in. Some tried and were turned away and came back. Some had no way else to go and had never left. Thibodeau, the young man who had laughed and said man is building a house 3 weeks earlier, had a 2-person dome tent with a broken pole, repaired with duct tape and a stick. He had a sleeping bag rated to 32 degrees. By Saturday evening, the snow was falling at 2 inches per hour. The wind off the lake drove it horizontally in the dark. It was -2 degrees Fahrenheit. The camp was nearly invisible under the accumulation. Thibodeau knocked on Ray's door at 9 p.m. Ray opened it. Thibodeau was shaking, not dramatically, not the way cold is shown in movies. The small, involuntary, constant shaking of a body working hard to maintain its core temperature. His tent had partially collapsed. His sleeping bag was wet. Ray stepped back from the door without saying a word. Thibodeau came in. He sat down on the floor with his back against the wall and pulled his knees to his chest and stopped shaking, slowly, over the course of about 20 minutes. He did not say anything about having laughed. Ray did not say anything about it either. There was nothing to say. A man had been cold and had come in from the cold. That was the whole of it. Phyllis came an hour later. She did not knock. She tapped twice, which was different. Ray had expected her. She had a woman with her named Sandra, different Sandra, no relation, who was 63 years old and had been at the camp for 6 weeks, living in a van that had no working heater. 4 people in an 8-by-8 foot space, about 100 square feet per person of combined air volume. Their body heat, 4 adults generating roughly 300 BTUs per hour each, added to what the structure had already retained. Ray had borrowed a small digital thermometer from Kate's 2 days earlier. He checked it at 11 p.m. Saturday night. Interior temperature, 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, -4 degrees Fahrenheit. Differential, 58 degrees. By 3 a.m. Sunday morning, the coldest point of the storm, when the temperature outside reached -9 degrees Fahrenheit, the interior held at 51 degrees. The differential was 60 degrees. With 4 bodies and no fire and no electricity, in a structure built from salvaged lumber and job site scraps and a $10 hollow core door, Curtis had stayed in his tent. He had his own system, not built, but led, 7 blankets deep, in a tent wrapped in a tarp, and he was fine. When Ray checked on him Sunday morning, digging through the snow to his door, Curtis said, "I told you I always kept a good edge." He meant it about more than the saw, but not everyone in the camp that night was fine. A man named Robert, quiet, mid-50s, who had arrived at the camp 3 weeks earlier and kept to himself at the far end near the water, did not come out Sunday morning. By noon, someone noticed his tent had not moved. By mid-afternoon, when camp residents dug through the snow to check on him, they found him alive but badly disoriented, unable to form sentences, his fingers blue-gray at the tips. He was taken to the hospital by ambulance. The paramedics used the word hypothermic. He survived. He did not come back to the camp. Ray learned about Robert on Sunday afternoon, standing in the snow outside his shed with 31 inches of accumulation piled against its south wall and the roof bearing the load cleanly, the 412 pitch having shed most of it onto the ground below. He stood there in the thin winter sunlight for a long time. He thought about what he had and what Robert had not had, and he understood that the distance between those two things was not luck of virtual preparation in any moral sense. It was just a pile of salvaged lumber at a curb on Elm Avenue, and 30 years of knowing what to do with it. The storm cleared Monday. The temperature rose to 15 degrees above zero, which felt, by contrast, almost warm. Dennis came to Ray's door Monday morning with a cup of gas station coffee. Black, 2 of them, 1 for each, and asked if he could look inside. Ray let him in. Dennis stood in the interior and turned around slowly, looking at the walls, the ceiling, the floor platform, the south-facing polycarbonate window. How warm did it get? Dennis asked. 54, Ray said. With 4 people, -4 outside. Dennis was quiet. He was doing the arithmetic. That's a 58-degree difference. Close to it. With no heat source. Bodies, Ray said. Bodies are heat source. Dennis looked at the walls. What did you do different? From just, A regular shed. Ray explained staggered studs. He drew it with a carpenter's pencil on a piece of cardboard. He showed Dennis how the outer studs and inner studs never touched, how there was no path for cold to conduct straight through. He showed him the poly-vapor barrier. He showed him how the floor was raised to break contact with the frozen ground. Dennis looked at the drawing for a long time. "Could I build one?" he asked. Not sheepishly, genuinely. "I'll help you," Ray said. 2 weeks later, a graduate student named Keiko from the University of Minnesota Duluth's School of Architecture came to the camp. She had heard about the structure from a social worker who had visited the camp after the storm. She brought a thermal imaging camera, the kind used in building energy audits, which shows heat loss in false color. She asked Ray if she could document the structure. He said yes. The thermal images showed almost no heat signature through the walls. The staggered stud system was performing. The images showed one area of heat loss, a corner where the cardboard insulation had compressed and left a gap. Ray had already noticed it. He pointed it out to Keiko before she did. She asked him where he had learned to build this way. He told her. She asked if she could write about it, not to publish anywhere grand, just for a class. A technical analysis of field improvised passive thermal structures. Ray said yes to that too. Keiko came back 3 more times that winter. She brought coffee and sometimes food and always her camera. She sent Ray a printed copy of her paper in February. He read it carefully, correcting 2 minor technical errors in the margins with his carpenter's pencil, and then set it on the shelf he had built inside the shed from a scrap of 2x10. He did not frame it. He just kept it there. Ray Thibodeau spent 2 more winters at the riverbank camp after the blizzard. He built 2 more structures alongside the first one for Dennis, one for Phyllis and Sandra. Each one used the staggered stud principle. Each one was slightly better than the last. In the spring of 2024, he was connected, through Keiko, to a nonprofit construction organization that trains and houses people in skilled trades. They hired him first as a participant and then, 3 months later, as a part-time instructor teaching framing and insulation technique. He is still in Duluth. He is not yet in permanent housing. He is working toward it. Katis left the camp in the summer of 2023 for a rooming house. He still calls Ray on the first Sunday of every month. Thibodeau built his own structure with Ray's help in December 2022. He sealed the door gap with a proper door sweep that Keiko brought him. He painted the exterior white for some reason, which he could not explain but which gave him what he described as a feeling of satisfaction. He was still at the camp, as of last report, and had started teaching 2 newer arrivals how to frame. The staggered stud drawing that Ray made on cardboard with a carpenter's pencil for Dennis. That drawing has been copied and redrawn by hand and photographed and shared in ways that neither Ray nor Dennis will ever be able to track. It has traveled to camps in Fargo and Billings and Portland. Whether those copies are accurate, whether anyone built from them, whether they helped, Ray does not know. What he knows is this: he spent 30 years building houses for other people. Strong houses, warm houses, houses with double stud walls and vapor barriers and roofs pitched to handle the load. Houses that will outlast their owners by 50 years. He knows how to build. That knowledge was always his. No job loss, no divorce, no truck tow, no winter took it from him. The only question, the one that sits under this entire story, quiet and heavy as snow on a 4/12 roof, is why it took losing everything else for the world to be in a position to benefit from what he already knew. We dismiss people. We look at a man dragging lumber down an alley in the cold and we see the circumstances and miss the knowledge. We see the camp and miss the carpenter. We see a pile of salvaged boards and do not see the 30 years of understanding standing behind them. Ray never needed the world's permission to build something warm. He just needed a pile of lumber at a curb on Elm Avenue. What do you know, right now, today, whatever your circumstances, that the world might be walking past? If you stayed with this story to the end, that matters. These are long stories. They are something of you. Thank you for giving them your time. There is another story on this channel waiting for you right now. Another person who used what they knew, in conditions that would have stopped most of us, to build something that changed the lives around them. These stories exist because the people in them deserve to be seen clearly, not as symbols, not as cautionary tales, but as what they actually are: skilled, resourceful, and worth listening to. Consider stay. Until next time, take care of yourself and pay attention to what you already know.